But in Genesis chapter number 22 this evening, starting in verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up, and went unto the place where God had told him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place far off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son, and took the fire in his hand, and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac said unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering. So they went, both of them, together. And they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him upon the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fear God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, behind him a ram, caught in the thicket by the horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of this place Jehovah-Jireh, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. This evening I would like to speak to you guys about trusting God in the unknown. Trusting God in the unknown. There are all different points in our lives where things change. When I went to college, I had no idea how I was going to pay for college. When I felt like it was God leading me to go to Africa to spend the summer with Josh and Julie, I had absolutely no idea how I was going to pay for it. I knew what God wanted me to do, but I had no idea how what he wanted me to do was going to happen. And that's often how it is in our lives. God will tell us what he wants us to do, but not quite give us all the details. He'll give us the next step of the plan. He'll tell us what we're doing next, but he's not going to give us everything. There are trials in our lives where we just have to trust God. We don't know how it's going to end. And often that actually is better for us to not know how it's going to end, but simply to learn how to depend on God and to trust him. And as we look at this story, there's several areas where you can see how Abraham trusted God. Now, looking at it, the first thing we need to look at is the command that God gave him. The command. So, in verse number 2, God gives the command to Abraham, Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering, upon the mount which I will tell thee of. And there's several things I see here. First, I see an urgency. Take now thy son. It's not take later, or take maybe in a week, or in a month, or in a year. We feel like it. No. When God tells us what to do, he expects us to do it now. He's not expecting us to wait until God reveals exactly how it's all going to work together. One of the things that Josh says when you're with him in Africa, that he said to me a lot when I was with him in Africa, and something that my pastor in South Carolina says a lot, is just do the next right thing. Just do the next right thing. We don't always know what step number 4 is. In fact, most of the time we don't even know what step number 2 is. We just know what step number 1 is. And that's all God expects of us to do. He expects us only to go as far as he had told us to go. But he expects us to take the step. God didn't tell Abraham how Isaac was still going to fulfill the promise that God had given him. He just told him, take him and go. I mean, you can see this in life. You have to start obeying God immediately to build towards bigger trials and events. When you look at David, he had a habit of doing the next right thing. When Samuel goes to him to anoint him a king, David is in the fields shepherding. After he gets anointed, he's back in the field shepherding when Saul's men come to get him for the palace. When Saul and the army go to war, Jesse finds David in the field pasturing, shepherding the sheep. After every event, David should go back to doing that which he knew to do. Daniel purposed in his heart before he was in Babylon that he would not defile himself. Later, when you get to chapter number 6, and the king gave the decree about prayer, in verse number 10, it says, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being opened in a chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks to God as he did aforetime. Daniel didn't start praying to God because he got into trouble. He was already praying to God. He already had the habit in his life. He wasn't waiting till the trial came. He's like, I'm serving God today, and I'll serve God tomorrow, and I'll serve God the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And then when the trial comes, he now had the faith to continue forward. But not only is there urgency, there's also movement. Now, for Abraham, this movement was actually a literal movement, go to Moriah. But even in the Christian life, there is movement. That's a spiritual movement. You're moving closer to God, or at least you should be. Paul often referred to it as a race. He referred to it as a race when he was talking to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Later on, he refers to having finished his course or race when he spoke to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter number 4. And Paul could say he ran the race. He's like, I don't run because I'm not running just to run. I'm running with a purpose. I'm running to achieve. But he's like, I'm never going to achieve. Just because you set in your mind to serving God today does not mean tomorrow you'll be a good Christian. There is a pattern of growth. You could start reading, you can set out tonight that you're going to read your Bible every day for a month, but until you actually go and do it, you haven't done it yet. Instead, it's often easier to say, I'll read my Bible today, and then tomorrow, I will read my Bible today. And then when you look back, you realize it's already been 10 years doing it. And that's how the Christian life is supposed to move. It's a race. Back in South Carolina, my friend Jonathan Washer, he is preparing right now to run a marathon. And so every week when I see him, he tells me how far he can run now. The first week he came in, he's like, I was able to do 5 miles. And the next week, he's able to do a little bit more, a little bit more. The last time I saw him before I flew up here, he said, today I achieved 16 and a half miles. Now, That's him now. That's like 2 months in that he's now there. But if he had said on the day of the marathon, I'm going to run this marathon, he either would have finished dead last if he finished at all, or he probably more likely would have dropped dead of a heart attack from the strain because his body is not ready for the race. And honestly, if God had given this challenge to Abraham 15 years earlier, Abraham would have probably failed because he didn't have the faith yet to do this for God. So there is movement in the Christian life, but also there's sacrifice in this command. He said, take now thy only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest. Offer him for a burnt offering upon the mount which I shall tell thee of. God doesn't just want you, he wants all of you. The point of offering Isaac up, as God says later, wasn't to offer Isaac up. It was so that God knew Abraham was willing to sacrifice anything to serve God. And often, once we realize that once we get to the point where we're willing to sacrifice anything for God, we realize we're not really sacrificing anything at all. One of my greatest regrets as a teenager is, looking back at it now, is that I spent more time playing video games than I did reading. Honestly, if I could go back, I would repurpose all those years for reading. Reading books, reading the Bible, studying more, praying more, because honestly, I was only doing what was necessary to pass by, to still look good without having to commit everything. And when you get older, you realize that it's easy, that might be the easy option then, but it hurts you later because there are things where you have to play catch up on. And if there is anything for the young people in this room for was determined now. Determine the purpose in your heart now to serve God. Because it's easier while you're still in the youth group, while you're still in elementary, or even while you're still in college, to determine to live for God then, than it to try to go backwards when you're older. But there's a sacrifice involved. Next, I want to see Abraham's faith. Abraham's faith. We don't see Abraham questioning God in this. At no point in the passage does Abraham ever question God about taking Isaac up to the mountain. Instead, Abraham immediately obeys. It says on verse 3 that he rose up early. Abraham wasn't just going to sleep in that morning. He got up, and he was like, we'll go get this done. See, in Hebrews, chapter 11, in verse 17 and 19, it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that received the promise offered up his only begotten son, of whom it is said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, and accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence he also received him in a figure. The Greek word that is under the English word accounting is actually a mathematical word. It is used to denote the completion of an equation or something that had been deduced through a logical explanation. So when it says accounting that God was able to raise him from the dead, it says Abraham literally went through and said, okay, if Isaac is where my seed is, if I don't have any seed from Isaac yet, then obviously, if I kill him, God is going to raise him from the dead because God's going to keep his promises. He had kept his promises before. Abraham had seen God take care of him. When God gave Isaac to him at 100 years old, God showed his power to Abraham that, yeah, God is capable of doing the impossible and that God would take care of it. The Hebrew word here in verse number 5 proves it again. And it says, where he says, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. Come again is in the first person plural. There are more than one, and Abraham is one of them. The only two people talked about is Abraham and the lad. So he's telling the men, I am coming back, and the lad is coming back with me. So he had already told the men, it's like, don't worry. I'm going up. We're going to worship God, and Isaac and I are both coming down together. At this point, Abraham doesn't know how God is going to protect Isaac. All he knows is that he's supposed to go to the mountain and sacrifice him. That's all he knows at this point. That's the only information he has to work on. But he knows what the promises of God say, and so he has faith that God will keep his promises. We have promises of God today all around us. God talks about the fact that he will work all things out for good to them that love him. Well, that doesn't mean, he didn't say he would make everything good for them that love him, but that he would work it all out for good that love him. So we can know that when we go through trials and difficulties, God has a plan, and he will see to it that the best outcome for us occurs at some point. It may not be immediate. We may suffer greatly between the beginning and the end of it, but at the end, it will end well for us. And that's a promise from God. That's one we can look back on because God gave it to us. But we also see this provision that God gave. Abraham gets ready to sacrifice Isaac, and the angel of the Lord stops him. And when Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a ram caught in the thicket. See, this is the part of the story that I think is the most wonderful part, is that God always provides for us. He's been providing for us since the beginning. And we even celebrate this time of year, Christmas, because God provided for us. Christ came, he suffered, he lived a perfect life, suffered and died to do exactly what this lamb was going to do, to be the substitute for us. And when you think about this, that God had asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, but God wasn't just going to ask him to do it, he was going to do it himself. And if there is nothing else that God ever does for us, that right there should be enough to compel us to do anything for him. That our God will be willing to come down to earth, to live among us, and then to die for us. That's too wonderful to even comprehend. See, he became our substitute. He became the provision that God had for the human race to deal with the sin problem. And God provides it for us in other ways throughout our lives as well. Honestly, if God had just stopped with just providing a way to heaven, he would have done enough. But he doesn't. He provides for us throughout our lives. During COVID, I could not work. It was not I did not want to work. I physically could not work because I cannot wear a mask. I cannot wear a shield over my face. Doctor's orders. I am not allowed to put anything on my face that's not attached to an oxygen mask, to an oxygen tank. And basically nobody else would listen to that, and the government didn't want to hear about that. So I wasn't allowed to work, but during the entirety of COVID and all the lockdowns, I was never at a want for money. I never had money, but I wasn't in need of it either. My school bill paid for, my rent was paid for, my car insurance paid for, gas was someone put in my tank, and I have food to eat. I don't know how I got the money for it all, other than that God provided for me in different ways. It never all came from the same source, and oftentimes the sources were varied as the sand on the sea, sure, but it all somehow came in every time. And I felt a little bit like Mueller at that point, thinking about how he always had enough money for the orphanage. You never knew where the money was coming from, but God will always provide for us as long as we're faithful to serve him. So I wanted to leave you with that challenge. Trust God, even when you don't know what's going on. Even if you don't understand how it's going to work out in the end, just trust that your Heavenly Father has everything under control. You would bow your